A woman's hair was cut, her face blackened. She looked like she had lost everything. Until a lone farmer stepped through the crowd and said just one line, "You're coming with me." From that moment on, the course of their lives changed forever. Don't miss this story. We're just a few steps away from reaching 1,500 subscribers, and we'd be honored to have you with us. Thank you to every kind soul who's joined us so far. With your support, we share peaceful, heartfelt stories that warm the soul. If you enjoy calm, meaningful stories, don't forget to subscribe. You're part of this family now. Now, make yourself comfortable. It's time for the story. The first scream cracked through the air, sharp as a gunshot echoing in the sky. Mark Bauer flinched as he walked slowly with his hands in his pockets. In the back alleys of this usually quiet, peaceful town, you didn't hear screams like that. That day, the only thing on his mind was getting the broken hinge of the barn door fixed. But when the second scream came, muffled this time, swallowed by pain, he stopped in his tracks. Something was wrong. That old feeling, the one that had stayed quiet inside him for a long time, but never really left, rose again, the feeling that squeezes your chest when you hear someone cry out in helplessness, in despair. Mark turned his head toward a narrow passage. There, between two buildings, he saw a crowd. Women in dusty skirts had formed a half circle, while some men stood behind, pretending not to care, though their eyes gleamed with a strange mix of curiosity and secret pleasure. Mark pushed through the crowd. In the middle sat a young woman, Clara Weber. He'd seen her a few times before, slender, quiet, carrying a deep sadness in her eyes. Now, her face was blackened with soot. Her hair falling to her shoulders was being cut off piece by piece. A pair of cold steel scissors caught the light and gleamed. The one holding them was Clara's mother-in-law, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed. Her hateful glare spread fear around her. Every lock of hair that hit the ground drew whispers from the crowd, words dripping with shame, lazy, useless, cursed. Clara's head hung low, eyes fixed on the ground. She couldn't run, she couldn't resist. One of her brothers-in-law held her arm, looking calm, as if he was just doing an ordinary chore. His fingers dug into her arm, making her wince in pain. The silence inside Mark cracked. His steps grew heavier, his boots thudding against the stone ground, echoing one by one. The crowd fell into shadow under his presence. The scissors froze midair. The mother-in-law lifted her head and locked eyes with Mark. "Let her go," Mark said. His voice was so calm it was like the silence before a storm. But underneath the words, there was a threat, one that would break out with thunder if ignored. Low chuckles rippled through the crowd. The brother-in-law gripped Clara's arm tighter. "What's it to you, Bauer?" he growled. "This is our family matter. None of your business." Without looking away, Mark fixed his gaze on Clara. "Get up," he said, a simple, clear command. Clara hesitated for a moment. Then slowly, she lifted her head. In her eyes was a spark, one that had endured pain many times, but still hadn't gone out. The brother-in-law's hand drifted to the gun at his belt. That was the moment Mark closed the distance in 3 steps. He set his left hand firmly on the man's shoulder. He didn't shove, but the weight of it, the determination, was enough. The man faltered, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "I said," Mark repeated, his voice heavier now. "She's coming with me." The mother-in-law tossed the scissors into a bucket and hissed with disgust. "You can't take her. She's our daughter-in-law. She's our property." Mark pulled off his old, worn scarf from around his neck. He placed it gently on Clara's shoulders, covering her torn dress. That small act drifted through the crowd like a cold wind. Clara trembled as she rose to her feet. The crowd fell silent. They stepped back, but whispers trailed after them. Mark walked beside Clara. He didn't place a hand on her back, but he stayed close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Together they passed through the crowd and stepped into the sunlight. Behind them, the town's noise faded. Ahead stretched wide open land. Clara's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her shoulders still stiff as stone. But now, on her face, there wasn't just soot, there was also the faint trace of hope. Yet as they moved farther away, Mark's instincts found no peace. He still felt the eyes of the crowd burning on his back, especially the eyes of 3 strangers standing quietly at a corner. They held the reins of their horses, their faces hidden by distance, but Mark knew they weren't there by chance. This story was only just beginning, and the dark clouds gathering in the sky didn't mean the storm was far away. They whispered it was only waiting for its time. The horse's steady trot beat against the ground, while silence stood like a thick wall between them. Clara sat in front of Mark on the saddle. She had her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. What was left of her hair, short and uneven, trembled in the wind, and the dark smudges across her face looked even harsher with every breath she took. Mark didn't say anything. He didn't want to break the silence. Some wounds didn't heal with words, only with time. But his eyes kept scanning the horizon. Those three strangers he'd seen in the town's shadows still haunted his mind. That old instinct inside him, the only thing left from everything he'd lost years ago, echoed one warning: danger. They rode for about an hour. The path was lined with dry grass, and a few trees stood faintly against the skyline. Mark tugged the reins lightly, slowing the horse down. Clara flinched and glanced at him, but didn't dare meet his eyes. From here on, the road narrows, Mark said in a low but steady voice. Act like no one's around us. But don't look back. Clara's throat tightened. She couldn't find any words, so she just lowered her head slightly. Still, she felt as if a dark shadow lingered behind them. And she wasn't wrong. Someone was watching. Quiet, patient, waiting for the right moment. After a while, Mark steered toward his land. In the distance, a small cabin came into view, worn by time, but still standing firm. In front of it, a rusty windmill turned slowly. When Clara saw the cabin, a strange sense of comfort washed over her. For the first time in years, it felt like she might actually have a place to take shelter. Mark stopped the horse in front of the cabin. Before helping Clara down, he looked into her eyes. In them he saw both the marks of being broken and a spark that still hadn't gone out. Without a word, he lifted her down gently. Go inside, he said. I'll take care of the animals. Clara nodded and stepped carefully up the wooden stairs. When she opened the door, she found a simple, tidy space inside. A small table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a narrow bed to the side. No dust. It was clear this man lived alone, but never let go of order. As Clara sat inside, she could hear Mark's heavy steps outside and his low voice calming the animals. It reminded her this was real. Yes, she was here. She was no longer in the hands of her mother-in-law and brothers-in-law. But in the back of her mind, their shadows still lingered, and she knew it wouldn't fade easily. When Mark came back in, he brought a bowl of water. Clean your face, he said. Clara looked at the water, then slowly dipped her trembling hands into it, wiping the soot away. The black stains melted into the water, and she felt as though even her own reflection was disappearing. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Mark watched her quietly, standing close, offering only his presence. When night fell, the wind howled outside. Clara lay down on the narrow bed in the small room, but she wanted the door left ajar. From the hallway, she could hear Mark's steady breathing as he lay on a blanket near the fireplace. Each breath felt like a strange kind of safety to her, but her sleep didn't last. In the middle of the night, a faint sound came from outside the cabin. At first, she thought it was just the wind. But then, it was clear, the whinny of a horse. Clara sat up on the edge of the bed, listening intently. Her fingers clutched the blanket. She shifted her gaze through the doorway crack. Mark looked like he was asleep, but when she focused, she saw his eyes slightly open. Slowly, his hand moved to grip the rifle at his side. Neither of them said a word, but both knew the same truth. They were still being followed. And tonight, the sound outside wasn't just the wind. When morning came, the air was cold, the sky covered in gray clouds. Clara sat on the doorstep, wrapped in the old flannel shirt Mark had left for her. The dew that had fallen through the night still glistened on the ground. But in the silence of morning, something felt missing. Even the birdsong was faint. It was as if nature itself had sensed the storm that was on its way. Mark stepped out of the barn, carrying 2 buckets of water. His face looked tired but alert. You heard it last night, didn't you? He asked. Clara's eyes flinched. She nodded silently. Yes, there was a horse. They were watching us. Mark lowered his head, set one of the buckets down. They haven't come yet. But they will, because they won't leave it unfinished. People like that can't rest until they finish what they start. Clara's chest tightened. Her lips trembled, but she tried to hide her fear. Do you want me to go back to them? Maybe then. She began, but her words hung in the air. Mark turned to her sharply, his eyes hard. Don't you ever say that again. I'm not sending you back there. No matter what it costs. Those words drew, for the first time, a thin line of safety through Clara's fear. But they also pressed the weight of the danger closer. Because Mark was just one man. He lived alone, decided alone. And now, because of her, all their wrath would fall on him. Through the day, Clara tried to keep busy with chores. She swept the wooden floor, tidied the table, scrubbed the worn-out pots. But each time she glanced out the window, she searched the horizon for a shadow. Meanwhile, Mark walked the land, checked the fences, preparing as if an attack could come at any moment. By noon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. The sound of horses' hooves rolled in with the wind. Clara's hands shook. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. Mark quietly picked up his rifle and leaned it by the door. Soon, 4 riders came into view. The horses thundered across the ground. Clara recognized them instantly. Her expression changed. Her lips whispered a pale breath. It's them. Yes, it was them. Her dead husband's 2 brothers. Hans, broad and heavy, built like a wall, and Lucas, leaner but quick as a whip. Beside them rode Otto, the sly-eyed man from town who had always lingered too close to Clara. And in a wagon behind them, her mother-in-law, Greta, her hair wrapped tight under a headscarf. On her face was that same venomous smile. The riders stopped in front of the house. The wind rattled the eaves, heavy silence hanging in the air. Greta stood up in the wagon and shouted, her voice carrying sharp. You're hiding what belongs to us, Bauer. That woman is our family's honor, our property. Bring her out at once. Clara shivered inside. Her hand clung to the doorframe. But this time, she didn't hide. She looked out through the crack. Their eyes met. Her mother-in-law's eyes burned like poison. Mark stepped out the door. His voice was calm, but solid as stone. She's not yours anymore. She's free from your cruelty. And she's staying here. Hans burst out laughing, a harsh, ugly sound. You stole her from us. The law's on our side. His hand slipped slowly to the gun on his belt. Mark stepped forward, rifle in hand. The barrel tilted low, but he was ready. Take one more step, he said, his voice cutting sharper than the wind, and you'll be buried in this dirt. Clara saw his shadow standing tall beside her. Fear still lingered inside her, but this time she didn't run. She stood with him, her voice shaking but firm. I don't belong to them, and I never will. Her words echoed in the wind. A silence stretched. Then Hans started to dismount. But just then, another rider appeared down the road. From the ridge, under the storm clouds, a glint flashed on his chest, a sheriff's badge. 2 armed men rode at his side. He pulled his reins and shouted, Hold it right there. On this land, the law is my word, and no one can claim a widow as property. Tears slid down Clara's cheeks. Mark's breath deepened, but he didn't lower his rifle. Because he knew, this was only the beginning. They weren't going to give up, and the real reckoning hadn't yet arrived. The sheriff's presence shifted the balance of the scene, but it didn't ease the tension. If anything, the anger hanging in the air only grew heavier, thick like the storm clouds above. The rider's breath steamed in the cold, and the pounding of hooves against the ground cut through the silence. Greta stood tall on the wagon and shouted at the sheriff, This is a family matter. You have no right to interfere. That woman is our daughter-in-law. She is our property. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward in his saddle. Greta, he said, his voice cold and sharp. No law allows anyone to own a widow. On this land, she is free. If you try to take her by force, that's theft. And if you do it under threat of arms, the law is clear. It's a crime. Hans leaned forward on his horse and let out a mocking laugh. Law? The only law here is whose gun is faster. You know that as well as I do. Mark's eyes caught Hans's hand sliding toward his gun. He lifted his rifle, ready to act, but the sheriff's gaze held him back. Because there was a spark in the air, and moving too soon could set off an explosion. Clara stood at the doorway, holding her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest. But she didn't look away. She remembered her hair being cut, her face smeared with soot, her helplessness. And then she remembered Mark wrapping his scarf around her shoulders, telling her, You're coming with me. This time, she swore she wouldn't surrender to fear. Greta leaned forward, her eyes locked on Clara. Clara, you're coming with me. Get down here now, or my sons will burn this door down. Let's see if that lonely cowboy can still protect you. Clara's lips trembled, but then her voice burst out, sharp as a cry that had been silenced for years. No, I don't belong to you anymore. I never did. For a heartbeat, silence fell. They hadn't expected that. Hans jumped down from his horse, mud splashing as he hit the ground. His hand went straight to his gun. Lucas followed his lead, tense and ready. Otto grinned slyly and lowered his rifle from his shoulder. Mark raised his own rifle. "One more step, and it'll be your last," he said, his voice slicing through the stillness like steel. But the storm was about to break. Hans lunged forward, reaching for his weapon. Just then, the sheriff spurred his horse ahead, the star badge on his chest catching the light. His two deputies drew their guns, aiming straight. "Stop," the sheriff roared. "Whatever land this is, the law answers to me. If you reach for those weapons, I'll have your graves dug before nightfall." Hans froze for a moment. Lucas clenched his jaw, his finger hovering over the trigger. Otto pointed at Clara, shouting, "She's cursed. If we don't take her, she'll ruin us all." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her breath caught in her throat. But then Mark's voice rolled out, heavy and unshakable, louder than thunder. "I'll stand by her. No one is laying a hand on her again." The sheriff's deputies dismounted, moving up to the fence with rifles ready. Greta spat on the ground in disgust. "This isn't over. Not the law. Not you, Bauer. That woman is our shame. And shame doesn't just disappear, it waits to be buried." Rain began to fall, drops hammering the roof as the wind shook the cabin. The riders slowly pulled back. But what Clara saw in their eyes wasn't retreat. It was the look of people biding their time, preparing to strike again. As Mark lowered his rifle, the sheriff stepped close and spoke quietly. "This is just the beginning. They'll come back for revenge. Be ready." Clara stood in the doorway, short, damp strands of hair clinging to her forehead. Her eyes held both fear and a newborn resolve. One thought echoed inside her. "This time I won't run." The rain didn't stop all night. The sky rumbled with thunder until morning, lightning flashing across the distant hills. Clara couldn't sleep. With every strike of light, she ran to the window, but all she saw was wet soil and fences bending under the wind. Inside her, the hum of an approaching storm only grew louder. Mark barely blinked until dawn. His rifle rested across his knees as he stared into the dying embers of the fire. The sheriff's warning echoed in his head, "Be ready." The words were as clear as an order. And Mark knew Greta and her sons weren't the kind to give up easily. By morning, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Clara tried to step out into the muddy yard to work, but Mark shook his head. "Not today," he said, his voice heavy. "They'll be here soon. Their eyes are everywhere." Clara didn't argue, but her fingers trembled. Inside her was both fear and a strange kind of strength. When she stood beside Mark, her mother-in-law's and brothers-in-law's voices seemed less terrifying. Yet, deep down, she knew even the walls of this house were nothing more than a thin shield against the rage that was coming. By midday, the wind stopped all at once. The silence was so thick Clara felt her heart rise to her throat. Then, hoofbeats, distant at first, then multiplying. The ground began to tremble. Clara ran to the door. On the horizon, 4 riders appeared. This time, they weren't alone. 2 more men rode with them, rifles in hand, determination carved into their faces. Greta's wagon stood at the center. From under her headscarf, her eyes glared icy and sharp at Clara. Hans and Lucas sat tall on their horses, weapons openly displayed. Otto bared his teeth in a grin, his eyes narrowing in hatred the instant they found Clara. Mark lifted his rifle and stepped onto the porch. "This ends here," he said. His voice carried heavier than the rain. "Anyone who crosses this line doesn't leave alive." Hans barked out a laugh. "You think you can stop us all by yourself?" he shouted, reaching for his gun. In that instant, everything moved fast. Mark raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked louder than thunder. Hans's horse reared and screamed, throwing him into the mud. He cried out, trying to rise, his shoulder torn by a grazing bullet. Lucas drew his gun in fury. Clara screamed. Mark fired again, the bullet ripping Lucas's hat clean off. He stumbled, but he wasn't hit. His pistol snapped up, aimed right at Mark. At the same time, Otto swung his rifle toward Clara. Her eyes widened in terror. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, Mark lunged, yanking Clara inside. The bullet splintered the wooden doorframe, spraying shards across the room. For a breath, the house was silent. Then Greta's voice cut through the storm. "Burn it. Burn that house to the ground. Let them turn to ash inside." Clara's heart slammed against her chest. Outside, She heard dry branches and hay being dragged, torn from the barn. The rain might fight the flames, but their will was stronger than the storm. Mark turned to her, his eyes hard but calm. "We're leaving through the back," he said. Clara shook her head, stunned. "But Dash, listen, if we stay, we burn. We'll run through the fence into the woods. I'll keep you safe." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she lowered her head. The woman who had been silenced for years now carried a spark inside her. And with Mark's words, that spark was turning into fire. Footsteps pounded at the front door. The crackle of flames rose. Smoke curled up through the roof, seeping inside. Clara coughed as the air grew thick. Mark slung the rifle over his back, unlatched the rear door. "Now," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "Run." When the latch gave way, smoke had already filled the house. Clara squinted, struggling for breath. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip hard as steel. "Run," he whispered again, almost under his breath. They burst out the back door. Rain hit their faces like a cold curtain. Beyond the fence, the swaying shadows of trees in the wind seemed to be waiting for them. But footsteps followed close behind. Otto's shrill voice cut through the storm. "You can't run. I'll find you wherever you hide." Clara's lungs burned. Her skirt dragged in the mud. Her feet slipped on the wet ground. Mark never left her side, keeping one arm ready to catch her if she fell. As they cleared the fence, the sight of flames rose behind them. Mark's house, the cabin he had built with years of his life, cried out in the fire like a wounded animal. Tears streamed from Clara's eyes. "You're home. Everything," she choked. Mark never looked back. A house can burn, but people don't. You're here, that's what matters. The forest swallowed them in shadow. But even there, the rain had soaked every branch. Hiding wouldn't be easy. Then a gunshot cracked. The bullet splintered into a tree right next to Mark. Clara screamed. Hans, wounded shoulder and all, had followed them. The others spread out, circling. Mark lifted his rifle, sighting through the rain. His shot ripped through the dark. Hans flew backward into the mud, his cry echoing through the forest. Lucas shouted in fury and surged forward, but Otto caught his arm. "Wait. We take the woman first. Once she's ours, Bauer will give in." Clara's heart nearly broke. "I don't want you to die because of me," she cried out. Mark's eyes hardened. "Clara, I'm not dying because of you. I'm living for you." The words struck her like a spark in her chest. She wasn't just running anymore, she was standing beside him. For the first time, she felt stronger than fear. The chase tore through the forest. Branches snapped, mud squelched under boots. Then, far off, lights appeared, lanterns. Riders from town. The sheriff and his 2 deputies, returning just in time. "Bauer," the sheriff's voice rang, driving his horse through the trees. "We're here." Mark pulled Clara close, moving toward the glow of the lanterns. Otto raised his rifle again, this time aimed at Clara. He fired. The bullet grazed her cheek. Clara staggered but didn't fall. Rage flared in Mark's eyes. He raised his rifle and fired once. Otto's gun spun from his hands, clattering into the mud. Screaming, Otto stumbled back into the shadows. Greta's voice rose out of the dark. "This isn't over. Shame will follow you." The sheriff pushed forward, his badge catching the light. "That's enough, Greta. On this land, the law is mine. If you come after them again, I'll see you in chains." The rain grew heavier, branches bending under the storm. Greta's eyes flicked to her son lying in the mud. But instead of grief, only hatred shone there. Still, with the sheriff's armed men closing in, she had no choice. "You got away this time," she hissed. Then she pulled her people back into the dark. Silence fell, broken only by rain. Clara leaned against Mark's shoulder, trembling. The sheriff dismounted and stepped close. "Your house is gone, Bauer. Burned to ash. But the woman is with you. That's worth more than any home." Mark lowered his head. "Yes, a house can be built again, but a life can't be replaced." Clara closed her eyes, her throat tight with words that finally escaped in a whisper. "You gave me my life back. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living." Days later, where the ashes still smoked, a new cabin began to rise. Clara hammered nails with her own hands, carried stones. Mark worked beside her in silence, but in his eyes there was a strange peace. He was no longer alone. And inside that new home, as Clara's shorn hair slowly grew back, the silver comb Mark had given her caught the light, reminding her every day, "You're free now." and you'll never be broken again. Their story had been written in fire, blood, and rain. But what came next would be the quiet story of a new beginning growing inside their hearts. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel.